Welcome to the channel. Today's story takes us back to 1875 to follow William, a black boy whose labor helped construct one of the most famous mansions of the Gilded Age, a place he was never permitted to enter. This is a heavy, emotional account of injustice, silence, and erased lives. Take a moment, breathe, and listen with care. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your presence helps ensure these stories are remembered, not forgotten. Let's begin. In 1895, the largest private home in American history opened its doors to the nation's wealthiest guests. 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling, a library holding 10,000 books, an indoor swimming pool heated by steam. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, stood as a monument to wealth, power, and ambition unlike anything the world had ever seen. George Washington Vanderbilt II, grandson of the legendary Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, had spent 6 years and millions of dollars creating his mountain paradise. Newspapers called it a palace fit for royalty. Architects called it a masterpiece of the Gilded Age. Historians would later call it the crown jewel of American residential architecture. But here is what the newspapers did not report. Here is what the history books forgot to mention. Here is what the tour guides at Biltmore still do not tell you when you walk through those marble halls. The majority of the workers who built that mansion were black. More than half of the 1,000 laborers who sweated and bled and broke their backs to raise those walls were African American men. Many of them were born into slavery. Many had parents who died in chains. And when the construction was finished, when the last brick was laid and the last stone was carved, not a single one of them was allowed to walk through the front door. This is the story of one of those men. His name was William. He was 14 years old when he first set foot on the construction site. And what happened to him over the next 50 years is a story of injustice, resilience, and a revenge so cold, so patient, that nobody ever knew he had taken it. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. Buncombe County, North Carolina, in the year 1875 was a place caught between two worlds. The Civil War had ended just 10 years earlier. Slavery had been abolished. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution had declared that no person could be held in bondage. But freedom on paper and freedom in reality were two very different things. The mountains of western North Carolina had never been plantation country. The terrain was too rough, the soil too rocky, the climate too unpredictable for large-scale cotton or tobacco farming. But slavery had existed there nonetheless. According to census records from 1860, there were 1,933 enslaved people living in Buncombe County. They worked smaller farms. They served in hotels and homes. They built roads and buildings. And when emancipation came, they found themselves free, but with nothing, no land, no money, no education, no prospects. Some left. They headed north to cities like Philadelphia and New York, searching for opportunities that did not exist in the South. But many stayed. They had been born in these mountains. Their parents were buried in this soil. And despite everything that had been done to them, this was home. In the decade after the war, something remarkable happened in Buncombe County. Freed black men and women began to buy land. Piece by piece, acre by acre, they scraped together enough money to purchase small plots from white landowners who were themselves struggling in the post-war economy. By the 1870s, several small black communities had formed in the hills around Asheville. They built churches. They established schools. They created their own economy, their own society, their own future. One of these communities was called Shiloh. Shiloh sat on a grassy hill overlooking the French Broad River, surrounded by the blue peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. It was not a large community, perhaps 28 landowners, maybe 100 people in total. But to the men and women who lived there, it was everything. It was proof that they were free, proof that they could own something, proof that their children would have a future different from their past. Solomon Turner was one of those landowners. He had been born in 1852 on a farm about 30 miles south of Asheville. His mother was a field hand. His father was sold when Solomon was 3 years old, and he never saw him again. Solomon spent the first 13 years of his life as property. He picked crops. He carried water. He was whipped when he moved too slowly and beaten when he spoke out of turn. When freedom came in 1865, Solomon was 13 years old. He could not read. He could not write. He had no skills beyond farm labor. But he had something that no master could ever take away from him. He had determination. For the next 13 years, Solomon worked. He hired himself out to farms and lumber camps and railroad crews. He took every job he could find, no matter how hard or how dangerous. He ate little. He saved everything. And in 1878, when he was 26 years old, Solomon Turner walked into the Buncombe County Courthouse and did something his ancestors could never have imagined. He bought land. 3 acres in the Shiloh community. It cost him nearly everything he had saved. But when he held the deed in his hands, when he saw his name written on that piece of paper declaring him the legal owner of that land, Solomon Turner wept. He was no longer property. He owned property. The son of slaves was now a landowner. The following year, Solomon married a woman named Ruth. She had been born free in 1858, just 3 years after her own mother had escaped from a plantation in South Carolina. Ruth was strong and smart and stubborn. She could read, something rare for black women in that time and place. She had learned from missionaries who came south after the war to educate the freedmen, and she was determined that her children would have even more than she did. On March 14, 1875, Ruth gave birth to their first child, a boy. They named him William. William Turner came into the world in a 2-room cabin that his father had built with his own hands. The floor was packed dirt. The roof leaked when it rained. The only heat came from a stone fireplace that Solomon had constructed from rocks he gathered in the nearby creek. It was not much, but it was theirs. From his earliest days, William was surrounded by stories. His father told him about the old times, about slavery and suffering and survival. His mother read to him from the Bible and from whatever books and newspapers she could find. His grandmother, who lived with them until she died when William was 6, told him stories that went back even further. Stories about ancestors who had crossed the ocean in chains. Stories about rebellions and escapes and unimaginable courage. Stories about a people who refused to be broken. William grew up understanding something that many people never learn. He understood that history is not just something that happened in the past. History is alive. History lives in the blood and the bones and the memories of every person. And the history that William carried inside him was a history of injustice, a history that was not over. A history that he would one day have to confront. The Shiloh community in the 1880s was a place of hope and hard work. The families who lived there had built something remarkable against impossible odds. They had a church, the Shiloh African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, where Reverend Boston Jenkins preached every Sunday. They had a small school where children learned to read and write and do arithmetic. They had farms that produced corn and vegetables and raised chickens and hogs. They had a cemetery where their ancestors rested, their graves marked with simple stones that bore witness to lives lived and struggles endured. William's childhood was shaped by this community. He learned to work alongside his father in the fields. He learned to read alongside his mother by candlelight. He learned the names of all the families in Shiloh, the Logans, the Owenses, the Jenkinses, the Whites. These were his people. This was his world. But the world outside Shiloh was changing. And that change was about to crash into William's life like a wave crashing against a shore. George Washington Vanderbilt II was 26 years old when he first visited Asheville in 1888. He was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt and the grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad and shipping magnate who had been the richest man in America when he died in 1877. George had inherited a fortune estimated at $10 million, which would be worth roughly $300 million today. But unlike his older brothers, who were busy expanding the family's railroad empire, George had different interests. He loved art, he loved books, he loved architecture, and he loved the mountains. George had come to Asheville because his mother, Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, was suffering from malaria. The mountain air of western North Carolina was considered therapeutic, and doctors had recommended the region for her recovery. While his mother rested, George explored the surrounding countryside. And on one particular afternoon, riding his horse along a ridge overlooking the French Broad River, he saw something that took his breath away, a panoramic view of rolling hills and distant peaks stretching as far as the eye could see. Blue mountains rising against a golden sky. A landscape of extraordinary beauty, untouched and wild. George Vanderbilt decided in that moment that he would build a house there. Not just any house, the greatest house America had ever seen. Over the next several months, Vanderbilt began quietly purchasing land through agents and attorneys. He did not want anyone to know that one of the richest men in America was buying property in Buncombe County. If word got out, prices would skyrocket. So he used intermediaries, men like attorney Charles McNamee, to negotiate with local landowners. By 1889, Vanderbilt had acquired approximately 100,000 acres in 4 counties. It was an astonishing amount of land, larger than many European estates, larger than some small countries. Much of it was forested hillside and mountain terrain, but some of it, the most important parts, was prime land with stunning views. Land like the Shiloh community. William was 14 years old in the spring of 1889 when the men came to Shiloh. They wore suits and carried briefcases and spoke in a language of contracts and valuations and fair market prices. They met with Reverend Boston Jenkins first, knowing that the preacher was a respected leader who could influence the community. Then they went door to door, family to family, making their offers. Solomon Turner was working in his field when they arrived at his cabin. William was with him, helping to plant the spring corn. They watched the men approach, their polished shoes already dusty from the dirt road. The offer was 10 times what Solomon had paid for his land 11 years earlier. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life, more money than he had ever dreamed of having. But Solomon did not answer right away. He looked at his field. He looked at his cabin. He looked at the trees he had planted when William was born, now tall enough to provide shade in the summer heat. He looked at all the years of labor and sacrifice that had gone into this place. And then he looked at his son. William would never forget the expression on his father's face in that moment. It was not greed. It was not relief. It was grief. Pure, profound grief. Solomon was being offered a fortune. But what they were really asking him to do was sell his freedom. The negotiations took several months. Some families accepted immediately, grateful for the unexpected windfall. Others, like Solomon, hesitated. They had built something here. They had created a community from nothing. How could they put a price on that? Reverend William Logan, who served as both a minister and a community leader, played a crucial role in the process. He negotiated with Vanderbilt's representatives on behalf of the Shiloh residents. He insisted that the families be paid fairly, that their church be relocated, that even the bodies in the cemetery be moved to a new location where they could continue to rest in peace. Vanderbilt, to his credit, agreed to all of these terms. The prices paid for Shiloh properties averaged around $37 per acre, significantly above the fair market value at the time. Some families received as much as 10 times what their land was worth. Vanderbilt paid $1,000 for the 1-acre parcel that included the church, a staggering sum for such a small piece of property. He also paid to relocate the church building itself and to move the graves from the old cemetery to a new site. The new community would be called New Shiloh. It was located about a mile east of the original site, close enough that residents could easily travel to work on the Vanderbilt estate, far enough that they would not be in the way of his grand vision. Solomon Turner accepted the offer in the summer of 1889. He had no choice. Everyone around him was selling. The community he had known was disappearing. To stay would mean isolation, surrounded by a vast estate owned by one of the richest men in America. On the day they left their land for the last time, Solomon took William to the field where they had worked together so many times. The corn they had planted that spring was growing tall and green. By autumn, it would be ready for harvest, but they would not be there to harvest it. Solomon knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt. He held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of it in his palm. Then he handed it to William. "Keep this," he said. "Keep it forever, so you never forget where we came from. So you never forget what they took from us." William kept that dirt in a small pouch for the rest of his life. The construction of Biltmore House began in earnest in 1889. George Vanderbilt had hired the most famous architect in America, Richard Morris Hunt, to design his mountain palace. Hunt had designed the base of the Statue of Liberty, the Tribune Building in New York, and numerous mansions for wealthy families along the East Coast. For Biltmore, he drew inspiration from the great chateaux of the Loire Valley in France, creating a design that blended French Renaissance architecture with American grandeur. The numbers were staggering. The house would contain 250 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. The construction would require limestone shipped by rail from Indiana, marble imported from Italy, and timber harvested from the surrounding forests. Vanderbilt had a private railroad spur built just to transport materials to the site. He constructed an entire village, Biltmore Village, to house workers and provide services during the construction. And he needed workers, lots of them. At its peak, the Biltmore construction site employed more than 1,000 laborers. They came from all over. Skilled craftsmen arrived from New York and Philadelphia, and even from Europe, stonemasons from England, woodcarvers from Germany, artisans trained in the finest traditions of European craftsmanship. But the majority of the workers were local men, black men, men from the displaced Shiloh community and other African American communities in the region. Men who had been promised steady work and fair wages in exchange for the land they had lost. A letter from estate management dated 1893 reveals a remarkable fact that is often overlooked in histories of Biltmore. At that time, there were more African American employees than white employees working on the construction of the house. The black workers formed the backbone of the labor force. They cleared land. They dug foundations. They hauled materials. They built scaffolding. They performed the back-breaking physical labor that made the construction possible. William Turner started working at Biltmore in the summer of 1889, just a few months after his family moved to New Shiloh. He was 14 years old, small for his age, but strong from years of farm work. His first job was carrying bricks. The estate had its own brick kilns on site, producing up to 30,000 bricks per day. These bricks had to be transported from the kilns to wherever they were needed on the construction site. Teams of workers, many of them young black men and boys, carried the bricks in wooden frames strapped to their backs. They walked miles every day, their loads growing heavier as the sun rose higher and the heat became more intense. William carried bricks for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. His hands blistered and bled. His back ached constantly. At night, he could barely move, but he never complained. He could not afford to complain. His family needed the money, and he had seen what happened to workers who complained. The foreman in charge of the black labor crews was a white man named Thomas Caldwell. He was not a local. He had come down from New York, hired by Vanderbilt's management team to oversee the unskilled laborers. Caldwell was not a violent man in the obvious sense. He did not carry a whip or a club. He did not shout or threaten. But he had a way of looking at you that made your blood run cold. A way of speaking that made you feel like you were less than human. A way of smiling that told you he enjoyed having power over you. William learned to avoid Caldwell's gaze. He learned to work in silence, to move quickly, to never draw attention to himself. He learned the unwritten rules that governed life for black workers on the Biltmore estate: never look a white man in the eye. Never speak unless spoken to. Never enter the main house under any circumstances. Use separate water barrels. Eat in separate areas. Stay in your place. The black workers and white workers technically worked side by side. Photographs from the construction period show men of both races standing together in front of the rising walls of the mansion. But payroll records tell a different story. The crews were segregated. Black workers and white workers might be in the same area, but they worked in separate teams, supervised by separate foremen, paid from separate accounts. And the pay was not equal. William earned significantly less than white workers doing similar jobs. This was standard practice throughout the South, where black labor was systematically undervalued. But it still burned. Every payday, when William saw how little he had earned for how much he had worked, he felt that familiar fire in his chest. The fire that his grandmother had talked about, the fire that came from generations of injustice. He did not let it show. He could not afford to let it show. But he never let it go out. As the months passed and the construction continued, William began to distinguish himself. He was reliable. He was hardworking. He never missed a day. And most importantly, he was smart. He watched everything. He listened to everything. He learned how the construction process worked, how the materials came together, how the design translated from paper to stone. One day in 1891, when William was 16 years old, an older black worker named Frederick noticed him studying the construction plans that were posted near the foreman's station. Frederick was 50 years old, a stonemason who had learned his trade in the years after the war. He was one of the few black workers on the site with specialized skills, and he was respected by both the black and white workers. Frederick had worked on buildings all over the South, and he had seen many young men like William, smart, ambitious, hungry for something more than carrying bricks for the rest of their lives. "You can read those plans?" Frederick asked. William nodded. "My mother taught me to read. I taught myself the rest." Frederick studied the young man for a long moment. He saw something in William's eyes, a determination, a fire, something that reminded him of himself at that age. "You want to carry bricks forever, boy?" Frederick asked. "Or you want to learn something real?" From that day forward, Frederick became William's mentor. He taught William the fundamentals of masonry, how to mix mortar, how to lay stone, how to read architectural plans not just as pictures, but as instructions, how to understand the mathematics of construction, the angles and measurements and calculations that turn drawings into buildings. William absorbed everything like a sponge absorbing water. He practiced at night after his regular work was done. He studied by candlelight, teaching himself geometry and arithmetic from books that Frederick lent him. He asked questions constantly about technique and materials and the history of the craft. "Why do you want to know all this?" Frederick asked him one evening. "What are you planning to do with it?" William looked toward the mansion, its walls now rising 3 stories high, its towers beginning to take shape against the darkening sky. "I am going to build something of my own someday," he said. "Something that lasts. Something that matters." Frederick nodded slowly. He had heard young men make such claims before. Most of them gave up when they realized how hard the road would be. But something about William made Frederick believe he might actually do it. "Then you better keep learning," Frederick said. "Because the world is not going to make it easy for you. The world is going to try to stop you every step of the way. And the only weapon you have against that is knowledge. Learn everything you can. Learn so much that they cannot ignore you. Learn so much that they have no choice but to respect you." William never forgot those words. September 14, 1891, was a day that changed William forever. He was 16 years old, and he had been working at Biltmore for more than 2 years. He had graduated from carrying bricks to working as an assistant to Frederick, learning the stonework trade. Life was hard but stable. His family had adjusted to New Shiloh. His father had found work on the estate as a general laborer. His mother had started a small business selling food to the workers. They were surviving. Then the newspaper came out. The Asheville Daily Citizen published a story on its front page that morning. The headline screamed about a near riot at the Biltmore estate. According to the article, 500 to 600 black workers had arrived at the site intoxicated and nearly broken out into violence. The story painted a picture of drunken black men terrorizing the construction site, threatening white workers and supervisors, barely contained by the forces of order. It was a lie. Every word of it was a lie. William had been there that day. There had been no riot. There had been no mass intoxication. There had been nothing unusual at all. Just another day of back-breaking labor under the hot Carolina sun. But the truth did not matter. The story spread through Asheville like wildfire. White residents who had been nervous about the large number of black workers at Biltmore now felt their fears confirmed. Black residents who had hoped that the construction jobs might lead to better opportunities now saw those hopes crumbling. Charles McNamee, Vanderbilt's estate manager, wrote a letter to the newspaper denying the story. He acknowledged that some workers, both black and white, occasionally drank alcohol, but he emphatically denied that there had been anything resembling a riot or mass disturbance. 5 other citizens signed letters confirming McNamee's account. The newspaper printed a brief response, claiming that its source had been sincere and that the story had been published in good faith. But the damage was done. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Biltmore changed. White workers who had previously been cordial or at least neutral toward their black colleagues now regarded them with suspicion and hostility. Some black workers were dismissed without explanation. Others were reassigned to more isolated areas of the site, away from white workers and visitors. And then came the news that haunted William for the rest of his life. Less than 2 weeks after the false riot story was published, a black man named Hezekiah Rankin was lynched in Buncombe County. Rankin worked as a brakeman on the railroad. He was not a Biltmore worker. He had nothing to do with the fictional riot. But that did not matter to the mob that seized him. The details of what happened to Hezekiah Rankin were too horrific for the newspapers to print in full. William heard about it from his father, who had heard about it from men who had seen the aftermath. A black man murdered by a white mob for no reason other than the color of his skin. That night, Solomon Turner forbade William from leaving New Shiloh after dark. "They are hunting," Solomon said. "And we are the prey." William obeyed his father. But something changed inside him that night. The fire that had always burned in his chest grew colder, harder, more focused. He had always known that the world was unjust. He had always known that his people were treated as less than human. But knowing something and feeling it are two different things. The murder of Hezekiah Rankin made William feel the injustice in a way he never had before. He wanted revenge. Not the hot, impulsive revenge of a young man, but something colder, something more patient, something that would take years to accomplish but would be worth the wait. He did not know yet what form that revenge would take, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would have it. The construction of Biltmore House continued through the early 1890s. William continued to learn and grow. By 1893, when he was 18 years old, he had become a skilled mason in his own right. Frederick had taught him well, and William's natural intelligence and work ethic had done the rest. He was assigned to work on some of the most prestigious parts of the house: the banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling and massive triple fireplace, the winter garden with its ornate stonework and glass roof, the library, which would eventually hold George Vanderbilt's collection of more than 10,000 books. William took pride in his work, even though he knew he would never enjoy the fruits of it. Every stone he laid, every wall he helped build, was a testament to his skill and dedication. And every stone was also a reminder of the injustice that surrounded him. One evening in the fall of 1893, William was working late in a storage area near the construction site. Most of the other workers had gone home for the night. William was organizing tools and materials, a task he often volunteered for because it gave him access to parts of the site that were normally off-limits. In a corner of the storage area, behind a stack of lumber, William found a wooden crate that he had never seen before. It was not marked with the usual labels indicating construction materials. Curious, William opened it. Inside, he found documents. Contracts, letters, financial records. At first, he did not understand what he was looking at. But as he studied the papers more carefully, their meaning became clear. Thomas Caldwell, the foreman who had made William's life miserable for 4 years, was a thief. The documents showed systematic fraud. Caldwell was falsifying payroll records, paying workers less than the official accounts indicated, and pocketing the difference. He was also diverting construction materials, selling them to outside buyers and keeping the profits. The scheme was elaborate and well-organized, involving multiple suppliers and falsified invoices. And the victims of this theft were primarily black workers. Caldwell was stealing from the people he supervised, the people who had no power to question him, the people whose complaints would never be believed. William's hands trembled as he held the documents. Here was the evidence of what he had always suspected. Here was proof that the system was not just unfair, but actively criminal. Here was a weapon. He could go to McNamee with this information. He could expose Caldwell and watch him be punished. But William was not naive. He knew how the world worked. He was a black worker. Caldwell was a white foreman. Who would believe him? Even with the documents, there was a good chance that Caldwell would talk his way out of trouble, and William would be the one to suffer. No. If William was going to use this weapon, he needed to be smart about it. He needed to be patient. He needed to wait for the right moment. He copied the most important documents, memorizing numbers and names and dates. Then he carefully replaced everything in the crate exactly as he had found it. He left the storage area as if nothing had happened. And he waited. The construction of Biltmore House was completed in 1895, 6 years after it began. The final cost was approximately $5 million, which would be equivalent to roughly $170 million today. It was, and remains, the largest privately owned home in the United States. George Vanderbilt moved into his mountain palace on Christmas Eve, 1895. He hosted elaborate parties and welcomed distinguished guests from around the world. Writers and artists and politicians walked through the marble halls, admiring the art and architecture, enjoying the lavish hospitality. None of them knew that the majority of the workers who had built this magnificent house were black. None of them knew about the community that had been displaced to make way for Vanderbilt's vision. None of them knew about the false riot story or the lynching of Hezekiah Rankin or the systematic theft that had been perpetrated against the black workers. And none of them knew about William Turner. There was a celebration for the workers when the construction was finished. A party with food and music and speeches thanking everyone for their hard work. The black workers were included, but in their own separate area. Separate food, separate entrance, separate everything. William attended the celebration with his father. They listened to the speeches praising the workers for their dedication and skill. They ate the food that was provided. They accepted the handshakes and congratulations of their fellow workers. And then everyone went home. The white workers returned to Biltmore Village or to their homes in Asheville. The black workers returned to New Shiloh and the other African American communities in the area. William waited until midnight. He waited until the estate was quiet and empty. And then he did something that he had dreamed of doing for 6 years. He entered the house. He walked through the service entrance, through the basement corridors that he knew from his years of work on the site. He climbed the stairs to the main floor. He walked through the halls he had helped build, touching the walls his hands had raised. He entered the banquet hall. The moonlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the massive room. The fireplace where William had laid stone stood silent and cold. The 70-foot ceiling soared above him, disappearing into darkness. William stood in the center of that room for a long time. He did not move. He did not speak. He just stood there, breathing, existing in a space where he was forbidden to exist. And then he wept. Not from sadness, not exactly. He wept from the overwhelming weight of everything he was feeling. The injustice, the pride, the anger, the determination, all of it pouring out of him in that empty hall, in that monument to wealth that his hands had helped create. He stayed for an hour. He walked through every room he could access. He memorized every detail. And then, when he was finished, he left, through the front door. The door that black workers were never allowed to use. The door that he had been forbidden to even approach. William Turner walked out the front door of Biltmore House and never looked back. He was 20 years old, and his life was about to change forever. The year 1896 began with a cold winter in the mountains of North Carolina. Snow blanketed the hills around Asheville, and the French Broad River ran gray and sluggish under sheets of ice. The Biltmore estate stood magnificent against the white landscape, smoke rising from its 65 chimneys, lights glowing warm in its 250 rooms. George Vanderbilt was hosting guests from New York, and the sounds of laughter and music drifted across the frozen grounds. In New Shiloh, a mile away, William Turner sat in his family's cabin and planned his revenge. He was 21 years old now. The construction of Biltmore House was complete, but there was still work on the estate, landscaping, outbuildings, the development of the farms and forests that Vanderbilt envisioned as a model of scientific land management. William had stayed on as a skilled mason, one of the few black workers who had transitioned from construction labor to a permanent position on the estate. But William's mind was not on his work. His mind was on the documents he had discovered 2 years earlier. The evidence of Thomas Caldwell's theft. The proof that the foreman had been stealing from black workers for years, skimming their wages and selling construction materials for personal profit. Caldwell had been promoted. He no longer worked directly at Biltmore. He had moved up in the Vanderbilt organization, taking a position overseeing other properties in the region. He lived in a fine house in Asheville now. He wore expensive suits and attended church on Sundays and was considered a respectable member of the community. William had watched all of this from a distance. He had watched Caldwell prosper on stolen money. He had watched him shake hands with prominent citizens and receive praise for his management skills. He had watched and waited and planned. The time had come. William had spent 2 years preparing. He had copied the most damaging documents and hidden them in a safe place. He had learned more about how the financial systems of the estate worked, confirming and expanding on what the documents revealed. He had identified the specific amounts that had been stolen and the specific workers who had been cheated. But William had also learned something else during those 2 years. He had learned that exposing Caldwell himself would be dangerous and probably futile. A young black man accusing a respected white foreman of theft? The authorities would never believe him. Even with the documents, Caldwell would find a way to explain them away or to shift the blame, and William would be the one to suffer the consequences. No. If William wanted justice, he needed to find another way. He needed to put the information in the hands of someone who could use it. Someone whose word would be believed. Someone who had the power to bring Caldwell down. In the spring of 1896, William traveled to Raleigh. He told his family he was visiting relatives. In truth, he had no relatives in Raleigh. He had a different purpose. William had spent months researching newspapers in the region, looking for journalists who had written about corruption and fraud. He found one name that kept appearing, a white reporter named James Thornton, who worked for a newspaper in Raleigh and had a reputation for investigating powerful people. Thornton had exposed a corrupt sheriff 2 years earlier and had written extensively about financial crimes in the railroad industry. William found Thornton at a boarding house near the newspaper office. The reporter was a thin man in his 40s with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He looked at William with suspicion when the young black man approached him. "I have information," William said, "about theft at the Biltmore estate. A white foreman stealing from black workers. I have documents." Thornton studied William for a long moment. He had heard such claims before from people with grudges or grievances who wanted to use his newspaper to settle personal scores. But something about this young man was different. There was a calm certainty in his voice, a precision in his words. "Show me," Thornton said. William handed over copies of the documents he had taken from the storage crate, contracts with falsified amounts, payroll records that did not match the actual payments to workers, invoices for materials that had been diverted and sold. A paper trail of systematic theft spanning several years. Thornton examined the documents carefully. His expression changed as he read. The suspicion in his eyes gave way to interest, then to excitement. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "I found them," William said. "Hidden at the construction site. I worked there for 6 years. I know what really happened." "And you can prove all of this? You can verify these numbers? I can tell you who was cheated. I can tell you how much was taken. I can give you names and dates and amounts. Everything you need." Thornton leaned back in his chair and looked at William with new respect. This was not just a disgruntled worker seeking revenge. This was a careful, methodical young man who had spent years building a case. "Why are you doing this?" Thornton asked. "If anyone finds out you brought this to me, your life could be in danger." William was silent for a moment. He thought about his father, who had sold his land to Vanderbilt with tears in his eyes. He thought about the false riot story and the lynching of Hezekiah Rankin. He thought about all the years of being told to look down, to stay quiet, to know his place. "Because someone has to," he said finally. "Because if nobody ever speaks up, nothing ever changes. And because that man stole from my people for years, and he is living in comfort while they struggle to survive." Thornton nodded slowly. He understood. In his years as a journalist, he had seen many forms of corruption. But the exploitation of black workers in the South was so pervasive, so accepted, that it was rarely even considered newsworthy. This young man was offering him a chance to expose something that most people preferred to ignore. "If I write this story," Thornton said, "your name will never appear. I will protect you as a source. No one will ever know where the information came from." "I understand," William said. "I do not want credit. I just want justice." The story was published 3 months later. It did not appear on the front page. Stories about white men stealing from black workers rarely made the front page in 1896. But it was published in a prominent position in the business section, with enough detail to be credible and enough evidence to be damning. Thomas Caldwell was named directly. The amounts he had stolen were enumerated. The scheme he had operated was described in precise detail. The article noted that the victims were primarily African American workers who had no recourse to complain or seek restitution. The reaction was swift. Caldwell denied everything, of course. He claimed the documents were forgeries, that the accusations were motivated by racial animosity, that he was being persecuted by enemies who wanted to destroy his reputation. But the evidence was too strong. Other workers came forward, emboldened by the article, to confirm that they had been underpaid. An investigation was launched by Vanderbilt's management, who were embarrassed that such corruption had occurred on their watch. Caldwell was dismissed from his position. His reputation was destroyed. The respectable citizen who had attended church on Sundays and shaken hands with prominent men was now a pariah, shunned by the very society that had embraced him. Caldwell never recovered. He left Asheville in disgrace, moving west to try to rebuild his life. He died 15 years later in California, alone and forgotten, working as a clerk in a dry goods store. William watched all of this from a distance. He never told anyone what he had done. He never sought recognition or credit. He simply watched as the man who had tormented him and stolen from his people was destroyed. The revenge was perfect. Cold, patient, complete. And no one ever knew who was responsible. But William was not satisfied. Destroying Caldwell had been necessary, but it was not enough. Tearing down an enemy did not build anything. It did not create anything lasting. It did not lift his people up or give them a better future. William wanted more. He wanted to build something. Something that would outlast him. Something that would matter. In the fall of 1896, William made a decision that would change the course of his life. He decided to leave Asheville. He had learned everything he could learn in the mountains of North Carolina. He had mastered the skills of masonry and construction. He had seen how the wealthy built their palaces. But he was still limited by the circumstances of his birth. In the South, a black man could only rise so high. The walls of segregation and discrimination were as solid as the limestone walls of Biltmore House. If William wanted to become something more than a skilled laborer, he needed to go somewhere else. He needed to go north. His parents did not understand at first. Solomon and Ruth had lived their entire lives in North Carolina. The idea of their son traveling to distant cities alone, without family or connections, terrified them. But William was determined. He had saved money from his years of work at Biltmore. Not much, but enough to get started. He had letters of recommendation from Frederick and from other supervisors who respected his work. And he had something else, something that could not be measured in dollars or written on paper. He had ambition. He had intelligence. And he had the fire that his grandmother had talked about. The fire that had burned in his people for generations. The fire that refused to go out. In January 1897, William Turner boarded a train heading north. He was 21 years old. He had never been more than 50 miles from the place where he was born. And he was about to enter a world completely different from anything he had ever known. He went first to Philadelphia. The city was overwhelming, more people than William had ever seen, more buildings, more noise, more everything. He found a room in a boarding house in a black neighborhood and began looking for work. It was not easy. The North was different from the South, but it was not the promised land that many black Southerners imagined. Discrimination existed here too, just in different forms. William was turned away from job after job, told that they were not hiring, that they did not need workers, that he should try somewhere else. But William did not give up. He had not come this far to fail. He knocked on every door. He applied for every position. He showed his letters of recommendation to anyone who would look at them. And finally, after 3 months of searching, he found work. A construction company that specialized in commercial buildings agreed to hire him as a mason. The pay was better than what he had earned at Biltmore. The conditions were better. And for the first time in his life, William worked alongside white men as something close to an equal. He stayed in Philadelphia for 2 years. He learned new techniques. He worked on larger and more complex projects. He saved every penny he could. And he continued to educate himself, spending his evenings studying engineering and architecture from books he borrowed from the public library. In 1899, William moved to New York City, the greatest city in America, the city where the Vanderbilts had made their fortune. The city where the future was being built. New York was even more overwhelming than Philadelphia. The buildings were taller. The streets were more crowded. The pace of life was faster. But William thrived. He found work with a prestigious construction firm that was building some of the new skyscrapers that were beginning to transform the Manhattan skyline. For the next 5 years, William worked and learned and grew. He became one of the most skilled masons in the city. He was promoted to supervisor, overseeing crews of workers on major projects. He earned the respect of his colleagues, both black and white, through the quality of his work and the strength of his character. He also continued his education. He took night classes in engineering and business. He studied the great architects of the age, learning how they designed their buildings and managed their firms. He saved money relentlessly, living simply and investing carefully in property and stocks. By 1904, when William was 29 years old, he had accomplished something remarkable. He had accumulated enough capital and experience to start his own business. William Turner, the boy who had carried bricks at Biltmore, was about to become a contractor. But he did not start his company in New York. He had always known that he would return home someday. The North had given him opportunities and education, but his heart had never left the mountains of North Carolina. His parents were still in New Shiloh. His community was still there. And there was work to be done. In the spring of 1905, William Turner returned to Asheville. The town had changed in the 9 years since he had left. It had grown larger and more prosperous, fed by the tourism industry that Vanderbilt's estate had helped to create. New buildings were going up. New businesses were opening. The railroad had expanded, bringing more visitors and more money to the region. But some things had not changed. Segregation was still the law of the land. Black citizens were still relegated to separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate churches. The gains of Reconstruction had been systematically dismantled by Jim Crow laws and racial terrorism. In many ways, life for black Southerners was harder in 1905 than it had been in 1875. William saw all of this with clear eyes. He had no illusions about what he was returning to. But he also saw opportunity. The black community in Asheville needed builders. They needed someone who could construct homes and schools and churches. Someone who could provide jobs and training to young black men who had no other options. Someone who could help his people build wealth and stability in a world that was designed to keep them poor and powerless. William started small. A one-room office in a basement. 2 employees, both young men from New Shiloh whom William had known as children. Their first project was a modest house for a black family who had been living in a run-down cabin for years. The work was good. The house was solid. Word spread through the black community that there was a new contractor in town, a man who did quality work at fair prices, a man who could be trusted. More projects came. A church renovation. A school addition. A row of houses for workers at a local factory. William hired more workers. He trained them in the skills he had learned in Philadelphia and New York. He paid them fairly, better than they could earn anywhere else in the region. By 1910, William Turner's construction company was one of the most successful black-owned businesses in western North Carolina. He had a crew of 20 workers. He had built dozens of structures. He had earned a reputation for excellence that extended beyond the black community to include some white clients as well. And he had never forgotten where he came from. In 1912, William built a house for himself. Not a mansion, not a palace. A modest home in New Shiloh, near the land where his father had once owned those 3 precious acres. The house had 2 stories, 6 rooms, and a large front porch where William could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. But there was something special about that house. Something that only William knew about. Years earlier, during the construction of Biltmore, William had taken something. Not stolen, exactly. More like salvaged. Bricks that had been discarded as defective. Stones that had been set aside as unusable. Small pieces of the materials that had gone into building the greatest mansion in America. William had kept these pieces for almost 20 years, carrying them with him through all his travels, storing them carefully through all the changes in his life. And now, finally, he knew what to do with them. He built his fireplace with those bricks. The same bricks that had been made in the kilns at Biltmore. The same type of stone that formed the walls of Vanderbilt's palace. Right there in the heart of his own home, William placed pieces of the house he had been forbidden to enter. It was his secret. His private victory. Every time he sat by that fireplace, warming himself on cold winter nights, he remembered. He remembered the boy who had carried bricks until his hands bled. He remembered the man who had walked through Biltmore House alone at midnight. He remembered everything he had overcome and everything he had built. The fireplace was his revenge made permanent. Not destruction, but creation. Not tearing down, but building up. Taking something that had been used to exclude him and making it part of something that belonged to him. His son asked him about it once. Samuel, born in 1908, was curious about everything. He noticed that his father sometimes touched the fireplace with a strange expression on his face. One evening, when Samuel was about 10 years old, he asked why. William was quiet for a long moment. Then he took his son's hand and placed it on the bricks. "These came from the biggest house in America," William said. "A house I helped build when I was not much older than you. A house where I was never allowed to enter through the front door." Samuel's eyes widened. "You built a big house, Daddy." "I helped build it. Me and hundreds of other black men. We did the hardest work. We carried the heaviest loads. We made that house possible. But when it was finished, we were not allowed inside." "That's not fair," Samuel said. "No, It was not fair. It was cruel and wrong. But I did not let it stop me. I took what I learned there and used it to build something of my own. I took these bricks and I put them in our fireplace so that every time we sit here together, we remember. Remember what? William looked at his son with all the love and hope that a father can feel. Remember where we came from. Remember what they tried to take from us. And remember that we can build our own future, no matter what anyone else says or does. Samuel never forgot that conversation. Years later, he would tell the story to his own children, and they would tell it to theirs. The years passed. William's company continued to grow. He built houses and schools and churches throughout western North Carolina. He employed hundreds of workers over the decades, training young black men in the construction trades, giving them skills and opportunities that they could not find anywhere else. He also became a leader in the community. He served on the board of the local black school. He helped establish a credit union that allowed black families to save money and borrow for homes and businesses. He donated to charities and churches and organizations that work to improve the lives of African Americans in the region. In 1920, William achieved something that would have seemed impossible when he was a boy carrying bricks at Biltmore. He built a school. Not just any school, a proper school building for the black children of New Shiloh, with classrooms and a library and indoor plumbing and electric lights. The school cost more than William could afford. He put his own money into it, and he raised more from other members of the community. He designed it himself, drawing on everything he had learned over 30 years in the construction business. And he supervised every detail of its construction, making sure that it was built to last. The school opened in September 1920. More than 200 children enrolled in the first year. Many of them were the sons and daughters and grandchildren of men who had worked at Biltmore. Men who had helped build the greatest mansion in America but had never been allowed to walk through its front door. Now their children had a school. A real school. A school they could be proud of. William spoke at the opening ceremony. He was 45 years old, his hair beginning to gray, his hands rough from decades of work. He stood before the assembled crowd, the parents and children and community members who had come to celebrate this moment, and he spoke from the heart. 45 years ago, he said, I was born in a cabin with a dirt floor, the son of a man who had been born in slavery. 30 years ago, I helped build a house for one of the richest men in America, a house where I was not allowed to enter through the front door. Today, I stand before you in a school that we built together. A school for our children. A school where they will learn to read and write and dream. A school where they will learn that they can build their own future, no matter what anyone else says or does. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Old faces and young faces. Faces marked by struggle and faces bright with hope. They told us we were not good enough, William continued. They told us we should know our place. They told us we could never be more than laborers and servants. They were wrong. We are builders. We are creators. We are the people who raise the walls and lay the foundations and make the impossible possible. And we will keep building until we have built a world where our children can walk through any door they choose. The crowd erupted in applause. William stepped down from the platform, his eyes wet with tears he refused to let fall. His wife Mary, whom he had married in 1906, took his hand and squeezed it tight. You did it, she whispered. You really did it. William nodded. But he knew that he had not done it alone. He had done it with Frederick, who had taught him the mason's trade. He had done it with his parents, who had sacrificed everything to give him a chance. He had done it with all the black workers at Biltmore, who had labored beside him, whose names had never been recorded, whose contributions had never been acknowledged. He had done it for all of them. And for all the generations that would come after. William Turner lived for another 20 years. He continued to work until he was past 60, when his body finally forced him to slow down. He turned the company over to his son Samuel, who had learned the trade from his father and had inherited his determination and skill. In his final years, William spent most of his time on the porch of his house in New Shiloh, looking out at the mountains he loved. Sometimes visitors would come, young men who were starting their own businesses, asking for advice. William always made time for them. He told them stories about his life. He shared the lessons he had learned. And he always ended with the same message. Build, he would say. Whatever they try to take from you, whatever obstacles they put in your path, whatever injustice you face, the answer is always the same. Build. Build something that lasts. Build something that matters. Build something that lifts others up. That is the only revenge worth having. William Turner died on October 3, 1940. He was 65 years old. He died peacefully in his bed in the house he had built, surrounded by his family. His funeral was one of the largest the black community in Asheville had ever seen. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Workers he had trained. Families whose homes he had built. Children who had attended the school he had founded. They filled the church and spilled out into the street, a testament to the impact one man could have on his community. His son Samuel spoke at the funeral. He talked about his father's life, his struggles, his achievements. He talked about the lessons William had taught him. And he talked about the fireplace. My father never told many people about those bricks, Samuel said. But he told me. He told me that they came from Biltmore House, the mansion he helped build as a young man. He kept them for 20 years before he put them in our fireplace. He said they were a reminder. A reminder of where we came from. A reminder of what they tried to take from us. And a reminder that we can take what they meant to hurt us and use it to build something of our own. Samuel paused, his voice thick with emotion. My father walked through the front door of Biltmore House once. Alone, in the middle of the night, when no one was watching. He said it was the only time in his life that he broke a rule he had been given. But he did not break it out of anger or rebellion. He broke it because he needed to know. He needed to know that he could stand in that place, in that palace he had helped create, and claim it as his own, even if just for a moment. Samuel looked out at the assembled mourners. Today, the Biltmore estate welcomes thousands of visitors every year. They walk through those halls. They admire the architecture. They marvel at the wealth and the beauty. And they have no idea that a black boy named William Turner helped build those walls. They have no idea about the community that was displaced to make way for that mansion. They have no idea about the workers who were cheated and exploited and forgotten. He took a deep breath. But we know. We remember. And as long as we remember, their story will never be forgotten. As long as we keep building, their legacy will never die. The school that William built still stands today. It has been renovated and expanded over the years, but the original structure, the building that William designed and supervised, remains at its heart. A plaque near the entrance tells the story of its founding. Visitors who take the time to read it learn about William Turner, the man who helped build Biltmore House and then came home to build something for his own people. The house that William built for himself still stands, too. It has passed through several generations of the Turner family. The fireplace with its Biltmore bricks is still there. Family members still gather around it on cold winter nights, telling stories about their ancestor, keeping his memory alive. And the Biltmore estate still stands, of course. The largest private home in America. A monument to the Gilded Age. A tourist attraction that draws more than 1 million visitors every year. In recent years, the estate has begun to acknowledge the role that African American workers played in its construction. There are exhibits and programs that tell the story of the Shiloh community. There are historical markers that recognize the black laborers who built the house. The name of William Logan, who served as foreman of an African American landscape crew, is now displayed in the estate's biography gallery. The name of Lewis Waters, who was born to enslaved parents and worked at Biltmore for years, is also recognized. But there is no marker for William Turner. His name does not appear in any official history of the estate. His story has never been told in the tours or exhibits or educational programs. Until now. Now you know. Now you know about the boy who was born in 1875, the son of a man who had been born in slavery. Now you know about the teenager who carried bricks until his hands bled, who learned the mason's trade from an old man named Frederick, who discovered evidence of theft and used it to destroy a corrupt foreman. Now you know about the young man who traveled north to learn and grow, who built a successful business, who returned home to lift up his community. Now you know about the fireplace with the Biltmore bricks, about the school that William built, about the legacy that continues to this day. And now you know the most important lesson of all, the lesson that William taught his son, the lesson that has been passed down through generations. They can try to keep you out. They can try to hold you down. They can try to erase your name and forget your contributions. But they cannot stop you from building. They cannot take away your skills and your knowledge and your determination. They cannot extinguish the fire that burns inside you. Build. Whatever happens, whatever obstacles you face, whatever injustice you endure, keep building. Build something that lasts. Build something that matters. Build something that lifts others up. That is the only revenge worth having. That is the legacy that outlives us all. William Turner understood that truth. He lived it. He taught it to everyone he met. And now it belongs to you. The year is 2025. 130 years have passed since Biltmore House opened its doors. The world has changed in ways that William Turner could never have imagined. Black Americans have won rights and freedoms that seemed impossible in 1895. There have been black senators and governors and generals and CEOs. There has been a black president of the United States. But the struggle is not over. The walls that William faced have been torn down, but new walls have been built in their place. The fire that burned in William's chest still burns in the chests of millions of Americans who face discrimination and injustice every day. If William were alive today, what would he say? What advice would he give to young people facing a world that still, too often, tells them they are not good enough, that they should know their place, that they can never be more than what others expect them to be? He would say what he always said: build. Build your skills. Build your knowledge. Build your character. Build your community. Build something that lasts. Build something that matters. And when they try to keep you out, when they close the doors in your face, when they tell you that you do not belong, remember William Turner. Remember the boy who carried bricks at Biltmore. Remember the man who walked through the front door at midnight. Remember the builder who created a legacy that outlived him. Remember. And keep building. Because that is how we win. Not by tearing down what others have built. Not by revenge that destroys. But by building something greater, something better, something that lifts us all. That is William's story. That is his legacy. And now it is yours.